Hello and welcome back to this video series on being and time. This time I will be discussing the chapter on historicity. And historicity to Heidegger is a concept that is about Dasein's stretchedness across time or temporality, or what you would call it, in that we are not something that is just in the present, and it is not just this static story of a beginning to an end, but historicity, as I understand it, refers to both the fact that we are this between points of our end and our beginning, our death and our birth. We are not just something that it is now, but Dasein is something that is this between. But it's also referring to the fact that we are not, that the sort of activity of stretching along this process of developing out from a starting point and stretching towards it's both its end and its future. And it's not the case, I believe, that your past is sort of this fixed point that you're moving necessarily further and further away from. Of course, in regular time, that is what's happening. But I think with Dasein, it's more that you are also retrieving your past in different ways. You're viewing your past through new lenses as you mature and stretch along this historical development, and the way that you view your past can change, and so it's not a fixed thing. But it doesn't just end, or how do you say it? Dasein's end is not simply at your birth, but at least the history, the actual history before your birth, affects you. It influences Dasein. It is not clear if that history is part. If Heidegger wants to say that is part of your being, necessarily. But I believe it is the case that since you are your possibilities, Heidegger says, and you can retrieve new possibilities through your history. Looking back at a time before you were born, you can identify possibilities that you hadn't been able to see beforehand and bring those into your own being, into your own projected future, and so incorporate that into your being, and so you can sort of retrieve yourself from further and further back in history. And then Heidegger, he is going over the science of history, trying to separate that from what he calls historicity, and he just mentions different ways that history is viewed in the common understanding, which is, he says, it's defined as just past events. Then you could say that is the science of past events, to be more specific. And you could say that it's also the specific history of something emerging. So it's the history of a becoming of a certain thing, leading up to some critical point. And you could also say that history is about past events that specifically concerns human civilization. Those are the ideas that he believes are circulating around in the culture. But of course, this is typically, or I think this would typically go under inauthentic historicity, to view history in this way, which I guess is fine for the sciences to work as a science, but he wants to say that there is this other way of viewing history, the authentic way, which of course sounds like the better way. Before I go into the authentic history, I just want to say that in the science of history, He wants to say that how objects can become historical according to him. So you have a thing that is present right now. You have some tool or some artifact or some fossil or whatever. Actually, fossil, that might be an exception to what I'm about to say. That would be interesting to hear, to know what he would say on that in particular. But tools, at the very least, historical tools. He states really clearly that what makes a tool historical is that the tool existing as a tool requires it existing in a world of tools, in a world of relevance. And the fact that a tool has become historical means that that world of relevance has been lost. So that's the absence of that world which would give it its relevance. That's what makes something historical. And again, something on the inauthentic view of history. There is one passage that is a bit telling on Heidegger's view of the world, maybe even his political views, I would say. And it sort of goes together with what he has said before about curiosity and wanting to learn about the world and all of its cultures and trying to integrate all of them into some unity. And it says in this chapter that the they has a demand for universality in everything that it's studying. And it wants to find universal rules for history, for example, which Heidegger clearly thinks is not it's not authentic at the very least. Is that the same for him as to say that it's bad? Kind of sounds like it, I would say. But in other parts, he wants, of course, the inauthentic way of being is the most common way that we all are, according to Heidegger. And he cannot say that being inauthentic is inherently bad. It's just one way of being. But it sort of slips through that he does kind of look down upon this view of universality for human history and human nature, maybe. So going over to the authentic historicity. And here he is going to go to he will reference an essay about by Nietzsche on the use and abuse of history for life, which is one of those texts that I've read before, and I would strongly recommend anyone to read that particular text of Nietzsche if you're going to read anything. It's not super long, it's not an entire book, but it's not just a single aphorism, and it contains so much, I think, of so much of the seeds of his later philosophy. This was written quite in the early stages of his career, but I just remember reading that and thinking that this, if you're going to start with anything, start from here, probably. Super interesting essay. And Heidegger, still remaining within or coming after Nietzsche, wants to build on that essay for his philosophy, and it does seem kind of forced. I will say it seems a bit forced that he wants to bring the context of the immediate culture to talk about man's being, and to say that the critical essay was just released not too long ago within his own culture. But anyways, referencing that essay, Nietzsche talks about 3 different ways of viewing history, which he calls the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical view of history. And if you have the monumental view of history, that is viewing history in terms of its past great events. Perhaps both great in terms of good and bad, I don't remember exactly now, but I guess mainly it's viewed in a positive way, I would think, that it's meant to view history as a source of inspiration, that great things are still possible to do in the future. The antiquarian view, that is more about having reverence for your culture and preserving tradition, preserving that unbroken chain of events that connect your own life to your ancestors and your past culture, where you come from, and to feel and to get a sense of rootedness in that culture, in your culture, and paying tribute to that. Then you have the critical view of history, which is looking at things as they are today, which you don't really like. Things are not the way that you think they should be, and we view history as a way of understanding how to avoid certain mistakes, how to understand where things went wrong, and how we can change things for the better. And all of these viewpoints to Nietzsche have their place, but they have also all have their risks or their faults, to go too deeply into any one of them. And here Heidegger wants to say that an authentic historicity means the integration of all of these three. And he says somewhere that it means to look back at your past, to learn from it, to rebel against it, but to do that for the sake of it. So it's not supposed to just be a copying of tradition. It's supposed to be, a critical view of that tradition, but not critical in the sense of destroying the tradition altogether, but to do it in a way which updates the tradition in some sense, that builds upon it, that evolves it, but doesn't completely cut it off from its roots. So, viewing our history in an authentic way, that introduces some very contradictory notions of what it means to be authentic, what Heidegger has talked about so far. Because authenticity has meant to sort of pull away from the they, from the herd in Nietzsche's language, but from the great masses, and to not think like the they that the everyday das man does, but to realize your own unique existence and your own unique death, most importantly, and your own specific situation and the possibilities that will reveal yourself to you and you only. So it's about individualization. Now he wants to say that there is such a thing as an authentic community, or a sense of an authentic sense of community, maybe. So like this individual authentic view of history, that's what is called, he names that fate, and then the communal version of that he calls destiny. So a community can realize its destiny. Now, does that mean that every single member of that community now has an authentic way of being? I believe the answer to that is no. But how is the group authentic if not all its members? One answer that I have come across is that the group can be guided by someone else, guided by an authentic historical figure that is the leader of the group in some way. Other than that, I don't really understand how this authenticity and communal feeling, communal sense can go together. But Heidegger evidently believed that there is such a thing. And you will realize in that authentic communal sense that you will be free for the task of your generation, that you will have inherited some task from your tradition that you will realize in this mode of being. Now, what that is of course specific to your tradition, what it is that you actually are that you have come from. And he also says something which he writes basically nothing on, but he does mention that you have the option in this view of history for Dasein to choose its hero. And like I said, no, he doesn't really expand on that at all. Okay, what does it mean for it to choose its hero? That the community chooses its hero, and is this, a historical figure, or is this something like some idealized figure, or does it literally mean to choose a person, or is this just an expression of like projecting some future non-existent person to be its new hero, to lead it to the that would be required to do this historical task that the community has now realized. I don't know. He doesn't say anything at all on that, I think. And all of this does seem a lot more troubling for Heidegger when you view it in the context of what he did after being in time, in his political life, which is of course one of the things that makes reading Heidegger extra interesting. Some maybe would say problematic. That he did actually become a member of the Nazi Party, and of course he never really shied away from that part of his life. So when you talk about your generational task and your hero, it does make you think of his actual history when you read it. And it's also something that is a bit strange, or it's a question that would be very interesting to ask him if possible, because it does seem that his authentic view of history, or historicity, requires a certain knowledge of your history. And so does it matter if that knowledge is more or less incomplete? If that knowledge is false, if you've been tricked about your history, it's been made up by someone, does it still become authentic? And how much history would you need to know to realize, your generational task, really? Does it require that everyone in the community is, of a sufficient historical education? Of course, everyone would have a notion of their own past since birth, but I can imagine that things would vary quite a big deal, or it does vary quite a great deal of how much you know about the history of your tradition and where you're from. And so, can you become authentic with any amount of history, or does it require some actual education to realize that part of your being, Heidegger? Again, he doesn't answer this question. I just thought it was an interesting consequence of what he's putting forward here. And then lastly, I would also just say that this chapter is actually quite academic, in a sense that he references other authors who also have been talking about the problem of history, specifically someone called Dilthey and Count York, who were, I guess, contemporaries in his time. So there it becomes more like an actual academic dissertation or like a paper instead of a, or as I view it at least, instead of a philosophical text. Those things might not be necessarily, contradict each other, but it just seems like a different style to me. But that's all I have to say really on this chapter on history. And next is going to be the final chapter of Being in Time, finally. So yeah. Thanks for watching.